The train from Paris had deposited Henri Dubois at the small station of Saint-Emilion, just as the September sun began its descent behind the rolling hills of Bordeaux. Our master wine appraiser, a man of 42 years, with hands that could read the age of a bottle like a fortune-teller reads palms, stood on the platform with his worn leather cases, watching the locomotive disappear into the golden haze. How many such arrivals had he made in his 25 years of service to the grape? Too many to count, perhaps, yet each one still carried that peculiar mixture of anticipation and wariness that comes with entering another family's private catastrophe. The carriage that collected him was once grand. You could tell by the quality of the wood beneath the peeling varnish, the ghost of a coat of arms still visible on the door. The driver, an elderly fellow with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades watching the road, said little beyond "Monsieur Dubois?" and a grunt when Henri confirmed his identity. This suited our appraiser perfectly. He preferred to form his own impressions, and the 40-minute journey to Château de Montmoreau provided ample opportunity for observation. The vineyards told their story first. Where once neat rows of vines would have stood like soldiers at attention, Henri now saw gaps, evidence of the phylloxera plague that had swept through 5 years prior. Some sections had been replanted with American rootstock, that desperate remedy that purists claimed would forever alter the sacred taste of French wine. Others lay fallow, surrendered to wild grasses and ambitious brambles. A fortune in the ground, Henri thought, slowly returning to wilderness. The chateau itself appeared through an avenue of plane trees, their leaves just beginning to turn. Built in the early 1700s, expanded in the 1750s during the family's golden age, it wore its decline with a kind of stubborn dignity. The western wing's shutters were all closed, rooms abandoned to save on heating, no doubt. The fountain in the circular drive still functioned, but algae had claimed half the basin, turning the water a melancholic green. Comte Auguste de Montmoreau received Henri in what was still called the Blue Salon, though the silk wallpaper had faded to something closer to gray. At 67, the Comte retained the upright bearing of his military youth. But his evening jacket, Henri noticed, had been turned, the subtle but unmistakable sign of genteel poverty. The inside worn to nothing, Henri mused, reversed to present the better face to the world. How perfectly it captures the entire situation. Monsieur Dubois, the Comte began, his voice carrying the authority of centuries, we require absolute discretion. Henri inclined his head slightly. He'd heard this opening more times than he cared to remember. They all required discretion when the creditors were circling. Naturally, Monsieur le Comte. My work is always confidential. The Comtesse entered then, a woman of 55 who had probably been beautiful in her youth and was now what the kind would call handsome. She moved with practiced grace, but Henri caught the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for the bell pull. Behind her came a younger woman, 28 perhaps, with intelligent eyes and an unfashionable dress that had been skillfully mended multiple times. My wife, the Comtesse Marguerite, and my daughter Isabelle, the Comte said. My sons are elsewhere this evening. Isabelle's lips tightened almost imperceptibly at this. Henri filed the reaction away. The absent sons, always a story there in families like this. You come highly recommended, the Comtesse said, settling into a chair that released a small puff of dust, despite the housemaid's obvious efforts. Monsieur Gallet speaks particularly well of your expertise. Lucien Gallet, Henri knew him by reputation, one of Bordeaux's most successful wine merchants, the sort of new money that the old families both despised and desperately needed. "Monsieur Gallet is too kind," Henri replied, though something in the Comtesse's tone suggested kindness was not Gallet's primary characteristic. The housemaid who brought the tea was young, perhaps 19, with the kind of prettiness that would cause trouble in a household with unmarried sons. She moved quietly, efficiently, but Henri noticed how her eyes darted about, taking in everything. Marie, they called her. An orphan from the village, he would learn later, taken in by the Montmoreaus when the local orphanage closed. "The cellar," the Comte said, getting to business with evident relief, "contains approximately 12,000 bottles, some dating back to my great-grandfather's time. We need a complete inventory and valuation for insurance purposes." Insurance? Henri almost smiled. It was never for insurance. It was for sale, always for sale. But the fiction had to be maintained until the last possible moment. These old families would rather die than admit they were selling their liquid heritage to pay for their solid one. Old Jacques, the cellar keeper, appeared after dinner to show Henri to his rooms. 71 years old and nearly blind, he navigated the chateau's corridors by memory and touch, his feet knowing every worn spot in the floor, every turn in the stairs. "You'll be in the tower room," he said, his voice like gravel in a leather pouch. "Best view of the vineyards, when there were vineyards worth viewing." The room was circular, sparse but clean, with windows facing 3 directions. Henri set down his cases and looked out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere below, in cellars that had been carved from limestone, before America was even a proper dream, lay 12,000 bottles of history. Tomorrow, he would begin the careful work of cataloging them, of determining what could be sold to save what remained. But tonight, as he unpacked his instruments, his thermometer, his calipers, his special lamp for reading faded labels, Henri allowed himself a moment of melancholy. Every estate he visited these days seemed to be in decline, each family struggling to maintain their position in a world that no longer had much use for their kind of grandeur. Progress, they called it. The railways, the factories, the new fortunes being made in speculation and industry. And yet, he thought, running his fingers along the smooth wood of his carrying case, they still make wine the same way, still age it in the same patient darkness, still wait for that mysterious transformation that turns grape juice into something approaching the divine. The morning of September 29th arrived with a mist that clung to the valleys like a memory of the sea that once covered this land millions of years ago. Henri rose early, as was his custom, and performed his ablutions with the careful precision of a man who understood that routine was the skeleton upon which a meaningful life could be built. The water in the basin was cold. Hot water, apparently, was a luxury reserved for evening, but it served to sharpen his senses for the work ahead. Breakfast in the servants' hall proved more informative than the formal dinner of the previous evening. Here, Henri could observe the household's true rhythms, the careful dance of hierarchy and necessity that kept such estates functioning despite their decay. Marie, the young housemaid, served porridge with preserved plums, moving between the long wooden table with practiced efficiency. The cook, a formidable woman named Madame Durand, ruled her domain with a wooden spoon and sharp tongue. Yet Henri noticed she slipped extra portions to the stable boy when she thought no one was looking. It was just as Henri was finishing his second cup of coffee, weak, stretched to make the beans last longer, that the commotion began. Isabelle de Montmoreau appeared at the servants' hall door, her usually composed face flushed with something between excitement and fear. "Monsieur Dubois," she said, ignoring protocol entirely, "you must come at once. The bottle has wept." The entire kitchen fell silent. Even Madame Durand's spoon stopped its stirring. Henry set down his cup carefully, noting how every face had turned pale. "The bottle, mademoiselle?"
"The weeping bottle, in the cellar. Father requests your immediate presence."
Old Jacques was already waiting at the cellar entrance, his clouded eyes somehow managing to convey deep concern. 50 years I've been here," he muttered, more to himself than to Henri, "and only twice before has it wept. Once before the railroad stocks collapsed in '72. Once before the young master died in the hunting accident." The cellar stairs descended into limestone coolness, 23 steps that had been worn smooth by centuries of careful feet. Henri counted them automatically. Numbers were facts, and facts were solid things to hold on to when entering the realm of family mythology. The main cellar stretched before them, a cathedral of wine with vaulted ceilings and alcoves that disappeared into shadow. The air held that particular mixture of dampness, oak, and time that Henry had learned to read like a language. The family had gathered in the third alcove, their faces illuminated by oil lamps that threw dancing shadows on the walls. The Comte stood rigid, while his wife clutched a rosary. Philippe de Montmoreau, the eldest son whom Henry was meeting for the first time, leaned against the wall with affected casualness, though Henry noticed the tremor in his hands. 32 years old, with the soft look of a man who'd never done honest work, Philippe had the bloodshot eyes and careful movements of someone managing a hangover. "There," the Comte said, pointing to a specific niche in the wall. "Do you see it?" Henry approached slowly, his professional eye taking in every detail. The bottle in question sat alone in its alcove, a 1749 Chateau d'Yquem, if the label was to be believed. And indeed, the bottle was covered in droplets of moisture, as if it had been crying. The limestone around it was completely dry, as were the bottles in adjacent niches. It was, Henri had to admit, an arresting sight. "How long has this phenomenon been observed?" Henri asked, pulling out his thermometer. "Since dawn," Isabelle answered when her father seemed unable to speak. "Marie discovered it when she came down for breakfast wine." Henri measured the temperature around the bottle, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, perfectly normal for a Bordeaux cellar. He examined the bottle without touching it, noting the authenticity of the label, the correct shape for the period, the appropriate level of ullage. Then, very carefully, he placed his hand near, not on, the bottle. There was definitely a temperature differential. "The family legend," the Comtesse said, her voice barely above a whisper, "says the bottle weeps exactly 1 day before a financial catastrophe befalls the house." 24 hours, Philippe added with a bitter laugh, "like clockwork." Grandfather documented it extensively, showed it to scholars from Paris once. They had no explanation. Henri straightened, his mind already working through possibilities. In his experience, family curses were usually family crimes, dressed up in supernatural clothing to avoid uncomfortable questions. But he kept his expression neutral, professionally interested. "I should like to examine the entire alcove, if I may, and perhaps learn more about the bottle's provenance while I conduct my general inventory." Father Mathieu arrived then, slightly out of breath, his cassock dusty from the quick walk from the village. 58 years old, with the kind face of a man who'd heard too many confessions and forgiven them all. He crossed himself upon seeing the weeping bottle. "So it's true then," he said. "I had hoped the rumors were exaggerated." "You've seen this before, Father?" Henri asked. "Once, as a young priest." The day before the Comte's brother lost everything in a venture involving colonial sugar. The family never recovered from that blow. Henri noticed Jean-Baptiste Moreau, the estate manager, had also joined them, standing in the shadows by the stairs. 35, competent-looking, with the calloused hands of someone who actually worked the land. His expression was unreadable, but Henri caught him glancing not at the bottle, but at the walls around it, as if measuring something. "If you'll permit me," Henri said, "I should like to begin my inventory immediately, starting with this section. The phenomenon may be related to storage conditions, airflow, humidity. These old cellars can create unusual microclimates." The Comte nodded absently, still staring at the bottle. "Whatever you need. But Monsieur Dubois—" He turned, and Henri saw real fear in the old man's eyes. "We are already balanced on a knife's edge. If this prophecy proves true, if another catastrophe strikes—" He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. As the family filed out, leaving Henri with old Jacques and his lamps, our appraiser began his real work. He examined not just the bottle, but the entire niche, running his fingers along the limestone, feeling for temperature variations, air currents. And there, so subtle he almost missed it, was the slightest movement of air coming from behind the bottle's alcove. Not enough to disturb dust, but enough to change the temperature just slightly. Enough perhaps to cause condensation on glass that was marginally cooler than its surroundings. "Jacques," Henri said quietly, "how long has this bottle been in this exact position?" The old man scratched his chin. "Since before my time, monsieur. It's never moved, never been sold, never even been touched except for cleaning day twice a year." "And the cleaning, who performs it?" "Marie, these days. Good girl. Careful." Before her, it was Annie, but she married and moved to Libourne 3 years past. Henri made a note in his leather journal, then began the meticulous work of cataloging the surrounding bottles. Each one told a story: vintage, provenance, storage history. But his mind kept returning to that subtle breath of air, like the cellar itself was sighing. Old buildings had their secrets, certainly, but in Henri's experience, it was usually the living who made them weep. That afternoon, Henri established his systematic approach to the cellar inventory with the methodical patience of a man who understood that truth often hid in details others found tedious. He had set up his workstation in the main corridor of the cellar, arranging his instruments on a wooden table that old Jacques had helped him carry down. The lamplight created a small island of clarity in the vast darkness, and Henri found comfort in this, the way work could carve out its own space in the midst of mystery and decay. Marie appeared around 3 o'clock with a tray of bread, cheese, and watered wine. She moved differently down here, Henri noticed, with the careful steps of someone who expected the ground to shift beneath them. "You don't like the cellars," he observed. Not a question, but an invitation. She set the tray down, glanced at old Jacques, dozing in his chair by the wall, then spoke quietly. "Last month, I saw shadows moving, near the back passages, where the oldest bottles are kept. But when I looked properly, nothing was there." "Shadows from your lamp, perhaps?" "Perhaps," but her tone suggested otherwise. "Monsieur Dubois, may I ask?" Do you believe in curses?" Henri considered his words carefully. This young woman, orphaned and dependent, lived in a world where the powerful controlled not just her present, but her future. "I believe," he said slowly, "that people sometimes curse themselves with their secrets. And those curses can seem very real indeed." She nodded, seeming to find some comfort in this pragmatic view, then hurried back upstairs. Henri returned to his work, but her words lingered. Shadows in the back passages. He made another note in his journal. The inventory revealed fascinating patterns. The Montmoreau collection was indeed impressive. Bottles dating back to the 1700s, arranged chronologically in most sections, but with odd gaps. Certain vintages that should have been there weren't, while others appeared in surprising abundance. In the fourth alcove, Henri discovered something peculiar. 3 bottles of 1870 Chateau Margaux with slightly different labels. Not forgeries exactly, but variations that shouldn't exist. "Curious," he muttered, holding one up to his lamp. The glass was right, the cork appeared original, but something about the label's printing seemed too fresh for a 13-year-old bottle. Philippe de Montmoreau chose that moment to descend, his footsteps uneven on the stairs. The afternoon had not been kind to him, his collar was loosened, and Henri could smell brandy from several feet away. "Finding everything in order, Monsieur Dubois." "The collection is extensive," Henri replied, diplomatically. "Your family has been excellent custodians." Philippe laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Custodians, yes, that's all we are now, watching over things we can no longer afford to drink." He picked up one of the bottles Henri had catalogued, turning it in his hands. "Do you know what it's like, living with all this wealth you cannot touch? Like Tantalus in his pool. Your father seems determined to preserve the collection." "My father is a romantic fool." The bitterness in Philippe's voice could have curdled milk. "He'd rather see us all starve than sell a single bottle from his precious inheritance. Meanwhile, I have creditors in Paris who are becoming insistent." Henri watched the younger man carefully. Philippe was the type who thought himself cleverer than he was, who would take shortcuts if he thought no one was looking. Creditors can be understanding, given the right circumstances. Not these creditors. Philippe set the bottle down too hard, making Henri wince. They don't accept explanations or delays. They accept payment in full on time, or they extract it in other ways. The threat hung in the air like the moisture on the weeping bottle. Philippe swayed slightly, caught himself against the wall, then seemed to realize he'd said too much. "Complete your inventory quickly, monsieur. We need that valuation by week's end." After Philippe's unsteady retreat, Henri continued his work with renewed focus. The discrepancies were adding up, not just the questionable 1870s, but gaps in the records that old Jacques kept. Years where the acquisition ledger showed purchases that didn't match the bottles actually present. Someone had been conducting a very careful, very gradual theft. As evening approached and the cellar grew even cooler, Henri found himself back at the Weeping Bottle's alcove. He examined the surrounding wall more carefully this time, pressing against stones that seemed solid but might hide mechanisms. His experience with other old estates had taught him that builders in previous centuries loved their secret passages and hidden doors, sometimes for romantic assignations, sometimes for escape during political upheavals, sometimes simply because they could. The limestone here was different, he realized. older in some spots, newer in others, as if the wall had been rebuilt or repaired multiple times. And that current of air, it was stronger now, as if responding to some change in pressure elsewhere in the building. Henry made a mark on his map of the cellar, noting the exact position. Isabel found him there as the dinner bell rang above. She'd changed into an evening dress that had seen better decades, but she wore it with a dignity that transcended fashion.
"You're very thorough, Monsieur Dubois."
"Thoroughness is the enemy of deception, mademoiselle." She studied him for a moment, and Henri saw intelligence there that was being wasted on the narrow life circumstances had forced upon her.
"And have you found deception in our cellar?"
"I've found questions. Whether they lead to deception or merely confusion remains to be seen."
"You speak like a philosopher rather than a wine merchant."
"In my experience, wine and philosophy are natural companions. Both improve with age, both can intoxicate, and both reveal truth when properly decanted." She almost smiled at that.
"Father would like you to join us for dinner. We have a guest, Monsieur Gallet from Bordeaux. He's interested in your findings."
Lucien Gallet, the merchant who'd recommended Henri for this position. How convenient that he should arrive just as the weeping bottle performed its trick. Henri filed this coincidence away with all the others he'd been collecting. As they climbed the stairs together, Isabel paused.
"Monsieur Dubois, whatever you discover down here, please remember, we are not just a family with debts. We are people trying to survive with some small measure of dignity intact."
"I never forget that, mademoiselle," Henri replied, and meant it. In every estate he visited, in every cellar he catalogued, he found the same thing: human frailty trying to dress itself in the clothes of former glory. It was enough to break your heart, if you let it. The dinner bell rang again, more insistent this time. Above them, the chateau prepared for another performance of gentility, another evening of pretending everything was as it had always been. But below, in the darkness of the cellar, the weeping bottle continued its mysterious condensation, counting down the hours to whatever catastrophe it foretold. Or perhaps, Henri thought as he followed Isabel up the worn stairs, counting down to the revelation of catastrophes that had already occurred, waiting patiently in the darkness to be discovered. October 1st dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn morning that made the vineyards look like they were painted in gold and copper. Henri had spent the previous evening enduring Lucien Gallet's probing questions about the collection's value, deflecting with professional vagueness while observing the wine merchant's peculiar familiarity with the chateau's layout. The man knew which doors stuck, which stairs creaked, knowledge that came from more than occasional visits. This morning, Henri descended into the cellars with a different purpose. The ventilation system of these old caves had been ingeniously designed, probably in the 1700s, when the family's fortune was at its peak. Bronze grates at strategic points allowed air to circulate, preventing the mustiness that could ruin cork and spoil wine. But someone had been tampering with them. The first evidence was subtle, scratches on the bronze that were too fresh to be original, mortar around one grate that didn't match the rest. Henri had brought a small mirror, the kind doctors used, and by angling it just so, he could see into the ventilation shafts. In the third one he examined, near the weeping bottle's alcove, he found what he was looking for: disturbed dust patterns that suggested regular airflow changes, as if something was opening and closing elsewhere in the system. "You're not cataloging bottles today," old Jacques observed from his usual chair. Despite his near blindness, the cellar keeper missed very little. "The storage conditions affect the wine's value," Henri replied, technically truthful. "I need to understand the entire environment." Jacques made a sound that might have been agreement or skepticism. "The young Monsieur Philippe was down here last night, after everyone was asleep. Heard his footsteps. I know everyone's footsteps." Henri paused in his examination. "What was he doing?" "Walking, stopping, walking again. Near the 1870s section, I'd say. Strange thing, he had someone with him. Lighter steps, careful ones, not family." Before Henri could pursue this further, Jean-Baptiste Moreau appeared at the cellar entrance. The estate manager rarely ventured below, preferring the vineyards and account books to the underground treasure. "Monsieur Dubois, might I speak with you privately?" They walked to a section Henri hadn't yet catalogued, where bottles lay horizontally in wooden racks that had begun to bow with age. Jean-Baptiste pulled out a bottle, seemingly at random, examining its label in the lamplight. "You have a reputation for discretion," he began carefully. "It's essential in my work. And for understanding complexity. Not everything is as simple as authentic or fake, valuable or worthless." Henri waited. In his experience, men like Jean-Baptiste, caught between the aristocracy they served and the working class they came from, often knew the most interesting secrets. "The family's situation is worse than they admit," Jean-Baptiste continued. "The debts aren't just from failed investments. Philippe has been gambling, badly. He owes money to people who don't accept chateau as collateral. Hence his midnight visits to the cellar." Jean-Baptiste's surprise was quickly masked. "You notice everything, don't you?" "Yes, I believe he's been supplementing his income, selling bottles, replacing them with inferior vintages." "The family doesn't drink from the cellar anymore. Economy, they say, so no one would notice." "Except a thorough appraiser." "Except that." Jean-Baptiste replaced the bottle carefully. "But there's more. The weeping bottle. It's not the first time it's been used to manipulate the family. My grandfather told stories, but that's all they were. Stories." Henri was about to press further when Marie's scream echoed through the cellar. Both men ran toward the sound, finding her near the 1870s section, lamp shattered on the floor, backing away from something in the shadows. "There was a man," she gasped, "right there, holding a bottle. When he saw me, he disappeared into the wall." Henri examined the spot she indicated. The wall looked solid, but he'd learned not to trust appearances in this cellar. Running his hands along the stones, he found what he was looking for, a slight give in what appeared to be solid mortar, a hidden door expertly concealed. "Old Jacques," Henri called. "What's behind this wall?" The cellar keeper shuffled over, his cane tapping on the stone floor. "Should be nothing. That's the outer wall of the original cellar. Beyond is earth and rock." But Henri had already found the mechanism, a stone that depressed just enough to release a catch. The wall swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a passage that sloped downward into darkness. The air that flowed out was different, cooler, carrying the scent of tobacco and something else, something chemical. "No one goes in there," Jean-Baptiste said quickly. Too quickly. Henri held up his lamp, illuminating the first few feet of the tunnel. Fresh footprints in the dust, multiple sets, recent. Wooden crates stacked against one wall, their markings in English. American tobacco, if Henri's guess was correct, the kind that should have been heavily taxed at customs. "This changes everything," Henri murmured. The Weeping Bottle's alcove was just 10 feet away. Any activity in this tunnel would alter the airflow, the temperature, create exactly the conditions for condensation. The family's financial curse was nothing more than a barometer for criminal activity. Philippe's voice came from behind them, slurred with morning drinking. "Well, you've found it then," he laughed bitterly. "Our family's real inheritance. Not the wine, not the chateau, but the secrets buried beneath it." They all turned to face him. He stood unsteadily at the base of the stairs, a pistol in his hand, not aimed at anyone, just held loosely, dangerously. "Did you know," he continued conversationally, "that every comte for 3 generations has known about this tunnel? Used it for different purposes, smuggling during the Revolution, hiding royalists during the Republic, and now we use it to survive." "Philippe," Jean-Baptiste said carefully, "put the gun away. We can discuss this reasonably." "Reasonably?" Philippe's laugh had an edge of hysteria. "There's nothing reasonable about any of this. The debts, the lies, that damned bottle's sweating away our doom. Do you want to know the truth, Monsieur Dubois? The complete truth?" Henri kept his voice calm, professional. "The truth is usually less dramatic than we imagine, monsieur." "Is it?" Philippe waved the pistol vaguely at the tunnel. "That passage connects to the old monastery ruins 2 kilometers away. The perfect route for moving goods that never passed through customs. Gallet knows. He's been using it for years, paying us a pittance for the privilege while making fortunes. And when we threatened to expose him, he bought up our debts. Now he owns us as surely as if we were still serfs." The pieces were falling into place in Henri's mind. Gallet's recommendation for this job, his convenient arrival, his familiarity with the estate. The wine merchant hadn't just been buying bottles. He'd been buying the family's silence and complicity, one debt at a time. The 2nd of October brought rain that drummed against the chateau's windows like nervous fingers. Henri had spent the night sleepless, turning over the implications of Philippe's drunken revelation. The young man had eventually been coaxed to surrender his weapon by Isabelle, who'd appeared like a specter in her nightdress and handled her brother with the weary expertise of someone who'd been managing his crises for years. Now, in the gray morning light filtering through his tower window, Henri made careful notes in his journal, documenting everything in his precise hand. A lifetime of cataloging wine had taught him that memory was unreliable, but ink on paper endured. Every discrepancy in the inventory, every sign of tampering, the hidden tunnel, all meticulously recorded. A soft knock interrupted his work. Isabelle entered, carrying a tea tray herself rather than sending Marie. She'd dressed in a severe gray dress that made her look older than her 28 years, but her eyes were sharp with intelligence and something else. Determination, perhaps. "My father doesn't know," she said without preamble. "About the tunnel's current use, I mean. He thinks it was sealed after his father's time." Henri poured tea for both of them, noting how her hands trembled slightly. "But you know. I manage the household accounts. I see discrepancies. Money appearing from nowhere, explained as wine sales that don't match any bottles leaving the cellar. I'm not a fool, Monsieur Dubois." "I never thought you were, mademoiselle." She took a sip of tea, gathering herself. 300,000 francs, that's what we owe, not to banks. They gave up on us years ago, to Gallet and his associates. Philippe's gambling debts were bought up, consolidated. Now they own us. Henri set down his cup carefully. And the weeping bottle? A convenient fiction that became inconveniently real. When the tunnel is used extensively, the air changes cause condensation. The family interprets it as prophecy, panic ensues, and in their desperation they become more pliable to Galet's suggestions. She laughed bitterly. We're being destroyed by our own superstitions. The door opened again, this time admitting Father Mathieu. The priest's usually kind face was drawn with worry.
Forgive the intrusion, but I felt compelled. Mademoiselle Isabelle, Monsieur Dubois, I must speak with you both.
The priest sat heavily as if carrying a great weight.
In confession, one hears many things that must remain sealed. But when I see evil being done, when I see a family being destroyed, he struggled with the words, I cannot tell you what I know directly, but I can tell you that you should examine the 1849 section of the cellar very carefully.
And that young Marie should be questioned about what she saw 3 nights ago. Before Henri could respond, commotion erupted from below. Shouts, running feet, the crash of something breaking. The 3 of them rushed downstairs to find old Jacques standing in the main hall, his clouded eyes wide with distress. "The tunnel!" he gasped. "Someone's sealed it. From the inside. And Monsieur Jean-Baptiste? He's gone." Henri ran to the cellar, the others following. The hidden door stood open, but 3 feet into the tunnel, a new wall of hastily mortared stones blocked the passage. The work was recent, the mortar still damp. More importantly, it had been built from the tunnel side, not the cellar side. "He's trapped himself in," Henri said, running his hands over the stones. "Or been trapped by someone else." Lucien Galet chose that moment to make his appearance, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "What's this commotion?" "I could hear the shouting from my room." Henri watched the merchant's face carefully. There was surprise there, but not the right kind. Not shock at the tunnel's existence, but at its closure. "The tunnel you've been using for smuggling has been sealed, Monsieur Galet." The merchant's composure cracked for just a moment before reasserting itself. "I don't know what you're implying, Monsieur Dubois." "I'm not implying anything, I'm stating facts. You've been using this family's cellar as a way station for contraband, taking advantage of their debts to ensure cooperation. But something's gone wrong, hasn't it? Your local agent, Jean-Baptiste, has either betrayed you or been eliminated by arrival." Galet's hand moved toward his pocket, but Philippe's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't." The young man stood at the cellar entrance, and this time his hand holding the pistol was steady, sober. "You've destroyed my family, Galet. Used our name, our reputation, our property for your schemes. Your family was destroying itself quite adequately without my help," Galet replied coolly. "I merely provided opportunities for mutual benefit." Henri heard something then, a tapping from behind the new wall. Rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was alive in there. He grabbed a wine bottle and tapped back. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The universal distress signal. The response was immediate, frantic tapping, then muffled shouting. Jean-Baptiste was trapped on the other side. "We need tools," Henri said urgently. "Hammers, chisels, quickly!" As the household scrambled for implements, Henri turned to Galet. "Your associates did this. They've discovered your operation and decided to eliminate loose ends. Jean-Baptiste knows too much, and this family knows too much. You're all in danger now." The wine merchant's composure finally shattered completely. "This wasn't supposed to happen. We had agreements, understandings." "The customs officials were paid, the route was secure." The 1849, Henri said suddenly, remembering Father Mathieu's hint. That's where your real secret is, isn't it? Not just smuggling, something worse. Isabelle gasped. The 1849 vintage was when great-grandfather died. Suddenly. They said it was his heart, but he'd discovered something, Henri finished, about this tunnel, about what it was being used for then. And someone silenced him. The weeping bottle legend started shortly after, didn't it? A convenient way to explain any strange occurrences, to discourage investigation. Tools arrived, and Henri began working at the mortar, which thankfully hadn't fully set. Philippe worked beside him, his wastrel's soft hands blistering quickly but not stopping. Even old Jacques contributed, his sensitive fingers finding weak points in the construction. As they worked, Henri's mind raced through the implications.
The Montmoreau family hadn't just been victims. They'd been participants, willing or otherwise, in over a century of criminal enterprise. Each generation thought they were the first to discover and exploit the tunnel, never realizing they were simply continuing a pattern established long ago. The weeping bottle served as both warning system and control mechanism, keeping the family fearful and compliant. The first stone came loose, then another. Air flowed through the gap, stale, tinged with tobacco and fear. Jean-Baptiste's voice came through, weak but alive. The monastery and they've sealed that too, running out of air. Henri worked faster, his careful appraiser's hands now instruments of desperate excavation. Around him, the family that had seemed so fractured was working as one, united by immediate danger. Even Gallet had grabbed a tool, whether from genuine concern or self-preservation, Henri couldn't tell.
The hole widened gradually, stone by stone, until Jean-Baptiste could squeeze through, gasping and covered in limestone dust. He collapsed on the cellar floor, chest heaving, while Marie rushed forward with water. The estate manager's usually composed appearance was thoroughly destroyed, his jacket torn, hands bloodied from clawing at stones, face pale with the knowledge of how close death had come. "They came at dawn," he managed between gulps of air. 3 men, maybe 4. Not locals. They knew about everything. The tobacco, the spirits, even the forged bottles. Said Gallet had been skimming from his partners in Marseille. Gallet had gone very still, his merchant's calculation visible on his face. Henri recognized the look of a man measuring exits and finding them all blocked. "The Corsicans," the wine merchant said quietly. "I told them the margins were thin, that customs was getting suspicious. You stole from smugglers?" Philippe laughed incredulously. "And you call me a fool with my gambling?" Henri helped Jean-Baptiste to a chair, but his mind was working through the broader implications. The sealed tunnel wasn't just revenge, it was a message. The Corsican networks that controlled much of the Mediterranean smuggling trade didn't tolerate betrayal. By sealing both ends with men potentially inside, they were demonstrating their reach and ruthlessness. "There's more," Jean-Baptiste said, his breathing finally steadying. "They mentioned the wine inventory. They know you're here, Monsieur Dubois. They think you're part of it, here to provide legitimate cover for moving the contraband bottles." The cellar suddenly felt much smaller, the shadows deeper. Henri understood now why he'd been recommended for this job, not just for his expertise, but for his reputation for discretion. Gallet had planned to use Henri's valuation as cover for a massive movement of smuggled goods disguised as legitimate wine sales. "We need to search the 1849 section," Henri said, remembering Father Mathieu's cryptic guidance. "There's something there we need to understand." Old Jacques led them deeper into the cellar to alcoves that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The 1849 section was peculiar. Instead of wine, it contained documents, ledgers, correspondence, all carefully preserved in the cool, dry air. Henri opened one at random and found himself reading manifests in multiple languages: French, Italian, Arabic. "My God," Isabelle breathed, reading over his shoulder. Great-grandfather wasn't just storing wine. He was running an entire trading network. The documents told a story of ambition and compromise, of a family fortune built not just on wine, but on circumventing laws that stretched back to Napoleon's continental system. Each generation had added their own layer of deception, until the criminal enterprise had become so entwined with a legitimate business that separating them was impossible. "Look at this," Father Mathieu said, holding up a particular letter. His voice shook slightly. "It's from the Bishop of Bordeaux, 1851. He's blessing the enterprise, calling it necessary for the preservation of the faithful during trying times." The church was involved. Henri felt the weight of history pressing down on them. This wasn't just about one family's debts or one merchant's schemes. This was about institutions, aristocracy, church, commerce, all complicit in a web of illegal trade that had persisted for over a century. A sound from above made them all freeze, carriages, several of them, arriving in the courtyard. Henri climbed the stairs cautiously and peered through a window. 3 black carriages had arranged themselves to block all exits from the chateau. Men in dark coats were taking positions around the building, with the efficiency of those who'd done this before. "The Corsicans?" Philippe asked, his brief sobriety evaporating into fear. "No," Henri said, recognizing the bearing of the men. "Customs officers. Someone's informed on the entire operation." Gallet went white. "Impossible! I pay them well." "You paid some of them," Henri corrected. "But the new prefecture has been placing his own men, incorruptible ones, throughout the service. I heard rumors in Paris, but didn't connect them to this." The Comte appeared then, still in his morning jacket, clearly bewildered by the sudden activity. "What is the meaning of this? Why are there government agents surrounding my home?" Isabelle took her father's arm gently. "Papa, we need to tell you something about the family finances." The old man's confusion deepened as his daughter began explaining, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Henri watched the Comte age years in minutes as he learned how his heritage had been corrupted, how his family's honor had been sold piece by piece to maintain an illusion of prosperity. "The weeping bottle," the Comte said finally, his voice hollow. "It was warning us, not of future catastrophe, but of present corruption." Heavy knocking at the main door interrupted them. Official voices demanded entry in the name of the French Republic. Henri made a quick decision. "Everyone into the cellar, now!" "That's madness," Gallet protested. "We'll be trapped. We're already trapped. But there might be another way." Henri had been thinking about the ventilation system, the multiple air shafts that had to lead somewhere. If one connected to the tunnel, others might offer alternative routes. As they descended back into the cellar, Henri's mind raced through possibilities. The customs officers would be thorough, but they were looking for evidence of smuggling, not necessarily people. If they could find another exit, disappear for a few hours, perhaps negotiations could be opened, some arrangement made. Marie suddenly spoke up. "The old well, in the back section. Jacques told me never to go near it. said it was dangerous, but I've seen rope marks on the stones, fresh ones. Old Jacques' blind eyes somehow managed to convey surprise. How did you— Child, that's not a well. It's a vertical shaft that connects to the old Roman aqueducts. The resistance used it during the war with Prussia. Hope flickered in the darkness. A way out, or at least a place to hide while the immediate danger passed. But Henri knew that escape was only temporary. The real question was what came after, how to untangle a web of crime that stretched back generations without destroying the family completely. Above them, they could hear boots on the floor, authoritative voices commanding search of every room. Time was running out. Henri looked at the assembled group, aristocrats and servants, criminals and victims, all united now by shared danger. "The aqueducts," he said decisively. "We go now, all of us, and then we negotiate. But first, we survive." The vertical shaft proved to be behind a false wine rack in the furthest reaches of the cellar, where bottles from the 1700s lay covered in dust thick as velvet. Marie held the lamp while Henri and Philippe wrestled the rack aside, revealing a narrow opening with iron rungs driven into the limestone. The metal was old but solid, each rung tested by generations of secret travelers. "I'll go first," Henri said, though his ankles still ached from that old cellar accident. Strange how past injuries returned at the most inopportune moments. He descended into darkness, counting rungs, 20, 30, 40, until his feet found solid ground. A vaulted tunnel stretched in both directions, Roman stonework still visible beneath centuries of moisture and mineral deposits. One by one they descended, Isabelle helping her father Jean-Baptiste, supporting old Jacques despite his own exhaustion. Marie moving with surprising agility, and finally Philippe and Gallet, the latter muttering about the ruin of expensive clothing. Father Mathieu brought up the rear, murmuring what might have been prayers or simply commentary on the absurdity of their situation. The aqueduct was a marvel of ancient engineering, its arched ceiling high enough to stand upright. Channels carved in the floor that once carried water to Roman villas. Now it served as an underground highway, connecting to various points throughout the countryside. Old Jacques, despite his blindness, knew exactly where they were. "Left leads toward the monastery ruins," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Right goes to the old mill at Sainte-Croix." About 2 kilometers. They went right, their footsteps splashing through shallow puddles that reflected lamplight like scattered coins. Henri found himself walking beside the Comte, who moved with the mechanical precision of a man in shock. "In my grandfather's time," the old man said suddenly, "this was considered patriotic, evading Napoleon's taxes, supporting the royalist cause. Every generation finds its justification, doesn't it?" Behind them, they could hear activity in the cellar, muffled shouts, the crash of wine racks being moved. The customs officers had discovered their escape route, but Henri calculated they had at least 20 minutes lead, perhaps more if the officers were cautious about pursuing into unknown tunnels. "There's something you all should know," Gallet said, his merchant's instinct for negotiation emerging even in crisis. "The Corsicans didn't just seal the tunnel as punishment. They left something inside, evidence that implicates everyone. Documents, samples, enough to destroy not just this family, but half the wine merchants in Bordeaux." "You kept records?" Philippe's voice cracked with disbelief. "Of illegal activities?" "Insurance," Gallet replied simply. "In our business, Trust is a luxury no one can afford. They reached a junction where the Roman aqueduct intersected with newer construction, medieval from the look of it. Water dripped steadily from above, and the air smelled of earth and age. Henri called a brief halt, allowing old Jacques to rest and orient himself. It was then that Marie made her revelation.
The man I saw in the cellar 3 nights ago. It wasn't the first time. I've been watching, following. He comes every full moon, always to the same section, always leaving with specific bottles. Who? Isabelle demanded. Marie hesitated, then pointed at Father Mathieu. His sacristan, young Thomas from the village. But I don't think he was stealing. I think he was replacing.
Putting bottles back. The priest's face went through several expressions before settling on weary acceptance. I suspected, but couldn't be certain. Thomas's father was transported to New Caledonia for theft 20 years ago, theft of wine from this very cellar. The boy has been trying to make amends, returning bottles his father sold one by one. Henri marveled at the layers of deception and redemption interweaving through this story. Everyone, it seemed, was trying to correct past mistakes while creating new ones. The weeping bottle wasn't crying for future catastrophes, it was weeping for the accumulation of small betrayals and desperate repairs that constituted daily life at Chateau de Montmoreau. A sound behind them, voices, disciplined and getting closer. The customs officers had entered the aqueduct. Henri urged everyone forward, but he knew they couldn't outrun younger, fitter men. They needed another solution. "Gallet," he said urgently, "you know these tunnels. Is there anywhere we can negotiate from a position of strength?" The merchant considered, then nodded slowly. "The old mill. It's technically on church property, exempt from secular authority without specific warrant. If we can reach it..." They moved faster now, urgency overcoming exhaustion. The Comte stumbled, caught by Jean-Baptiste, who'd somehow become protective of his employer despite everything. Isabelle had torn her skirts for better movement and helped Marie carry the lamp. Even Philippe showed unexpected stamina, perhaps finally finding a crisis that external action could solve. The tunnel began to slope upward, and fresher air suggested they were nearing the surface. But the voices behind them were getting closer, and Henri could see lamplight reflecting off the wet walls. They had minutes at most. Then, unexpectedly, help came from above. A rope ladder dropped through a shaft in the ceiling, and a face appeared, young, earnest, worried. Thomas, the sacristan Marie had identified, called down urgently. "Father Mathieu, quickly! I've been watching the roads. More agents are coming from Libourne." One by one, they climbed, Henri pushing others ahead, despite his ankle's protests. He could hear running feet now, see uniform shadows in the tunnel. As Gallet, the last besides Henri, reached for the ladder, a customs officer rounded the corner, pistol raised. "Stop! In the name of the Republic!" Henri faced the officer, a young man, barely older than Marie, whose hand shook slightly as he aimed. "We're coming up peacefully," Henri said calmly. "We're not armed, and we're not fleeing. We're seeking sanctuary on church property to negotiate properly." The officer hesitated, training, warring with the complexities of jurisdiction. In that moment, Henri understood that even the forces of law were human, uncertain, trying to do right in a world that rarely offered clear choices. "My name is Henri Dubois," he continued, pulling out his identification. "I'm a licensed appraiser from Paris, here on legitimate business. What I've discovered involves more than simple smuggling. It touches on some of the oldest families in Bordeaux. This needs to be handled delicately, officially. Your superiors will want to be involved."
The young officer lowered his weapon slightly, confusion replacing certainty. It was enough. Henri grabbed the ladder and climbed, hearing the officer calling for his sergeant rather than shooting. The old mill at Sainte-Croix stood like a stone sentinel beside the dried stream bed, its wheel frozen in time since the water had been diverted 30 years ago for irrigation. Inside, shafts of afternoon light pierced through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced like golden wine in a glass. The group had gathered in what was once the grinding room, seated on ancient millstones and broken beams, while Thomas stood watch at the window.
Father Mathieu had invoked sanctuary, an old rite that still carried weight in rural France, buying them time before the customs officers could obtain proper warrants. But Henri knew this was merely postponement, not solution. Through the glassless windows they could see uniformed men establishing a perimeter, patient as cats at a mouse hole. "We need to control the narrative," Henri said, his appraiser's mind sorting through options like examining vintages. "The evidence in that sealed tunnel, if it truly implicates half of Bordeaux, then there are powerful people who'll want this handled quietly." Gallet laughed bitterly. "You think they'll negotiate? The prefecture's new man, Fouché, he's incorruptible, believes in the Republic, in justice, in all those noble concepts that destroy practical men." "Everyone negotiates," Isabelle said quietly. "It's only a matter of finding what they value more than their principles." Her father looked at her with surprise, perhaps seeing for the first time the steel beneath his daughter's dutiful exterior. The Comte had aged visibly in the past hours, his aristocratic bearing crumbling like old mortar. "I've failed you all," he said simply. "Failed to protect the family honor. Failed to see what was happening beneath my own roof." "The failure goes back generations, Papa," Isabelle replied, not unkindly. "We've all been maintaining a fiction, pretending the chateau still stood on solid ground when the foundation had rotted long ago." Jean-Baptiste had been silent until now, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I need to confess something," he said suddenly. "My family, the Moreaus, we weren't always merchants. My grandfather was the Comte's grandfather's bastard son, unacknowledged, given a small pension, and told to disappear. I've known about the tunnel my whole life. My grandmother told me, said it was my birthright as much as any Montmoreau's." The revelation hung in the air like the scent of fermentation. Philippe stared at the estate manager, his possible cousin, with a mixture of shock and something like recognition. "That's why you stayed," he said slowly. "Not loyalty to servants' wages, but belonging," Jean-Baptiste finished. "Even if unrecognized, even if secret. The tunnel, the smuggling. I told myself I was taking what should have been mine anyway." Henri found himself thinking of his late wife, how she'd always said that families were built on shared secrets more than shared blood. Every household had its hidden rooms, its unspoken agreements, its careful dance around truth. The weeping bottle had been crying for all of them, acknowledged and unacknowledged, legitimate and illegitimate, all bound together by compromise and deception. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a fine carriage arriving, out of place among the military vehicles. A man emerged, middle-aged, impeccably dressed, with the bearing of someone used to authority. Henri recognized him from newspaper illustrations. Fouché, the new prefecture, the incorruptible one. "He's coming himself," Gallet said. And for the first time, Henri heard fear in the merchant's voice. "This is bigger than I thought." Fouché entered the mill alone, a gesture of confidence or trust that Henri couldn't quite read. He was younger than expected, perhaps 45, with intelligent eyes that took in the assembled group without judgment, merely assessment. "Monsieur Dubois," he said, addressing Henri directly, "your reputation precedes you. I've read your report on the Chateau Margaux fraud of 1878. Thorough work. You're well informed, Monsieur Fouché." "It's my business to be." The prefecture found a relatively clean section of wall to lean against, his posture casual but alert. "I know who everyone here is, what they've done, what they're planning to claim. I also know what's in that sealed tunnel. My men have been watching this operation for 6 months." "Then why—" Philippe began, but Fouché raised a hand. "Because we wanted the Corsicans. The local smuggling, the tax evasion, that's small business compared to the network they're building. Arms, not just tobacco. Revolutionary materials, not just wine. Your little tunnel, Monsieur Gallet, was becoming a highway for insurrection." The temperature in the mill seemed to drop. Henri understood now. They'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than financial crime. The Third Republic, barely a decade old, lived in constant fear of another revolution, another commune. "But the Corsicans sealed the tunnel," Isabelle pointed out. "They've cut their own route." "Have they?" Fouché smiled slightly. "Or have they simply removed evidence of their involvement, leaving you all to take the blame? Those documents Monsieur Gallet mentioned, I'd wager they implicate everyone except the real organizers." Henri saw it then, the full picture. The Montmoreaus, Gallet, even the Corsicans, all pawns in a larger game. The weeping bottle hadn't been warning of catastrophe, but marking it, drop by drop, as trust evaporated and left only residue behind. "What do you want?" the Comte asked, his voice steady despite everything. Fouché straightened. "Cooperation. Information. The complete truth about everything that's passed through that tunnel in the last year. In exchange, the family keeps the chateau, though the wine collection will need to be properly audited and taxes paid. Monsieur Gallet faces charges, but might avoid prison if his testimony is valuable enough." The servants, he looked at Marie, at Thomas, were following orders. No charges if they cooperate. "And if we refuse?" Philippe asked. "Then everyone hangs except the Corsicans, who are already sailing back to their island, counting the gold they've earned from selling French secrets to German agents." The mill fell silent except for the creaking of old wood in the wind. Henri could feel the weight of decision pressing on everyone. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky the color of aged burgundy. Somewhere back at the chateau, the weeping bottle sat in its alcove, no longer crying, its purpose served or surrendered. "I'll need a complete inventory," Henri said finally. "Every bottle, every document, every transaction. The truth, all of it, sorted and catalogued properly." Fouché nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." "The Republic needs men who can distinguish between authentic and false, whether in wine or testimony." Old Jacques spoke for the first time in an hour, his blind eyes somehow seeing more than anyone. The bottle knew. It always knew. Every drop was a truth trying to escape. The next 2 days passed in a blur of testimony and documentation. The chateau had been transformed into a makeshift courthouse, with Fouché's clerks occupying the blue salon, their ink-stained fingers recording every confession, every detail of the smuggling operation. Henri worked alongside them, his expertise essential in distinguishing the genuine bottles from forgeries, the legitimate sales from the criminal ones. October 5th dawned clear and cold. Henri found himself in the cellar before sunrise, conducting his final inventory by lamplight.
The weeping bottle sat silent in its alcove, no longer perspiring, as if exhausted by its long vigil.
He measured it one last time, noting the temperature, perfectly stable now that the tunnel was sealed and the air currents had normalized. Marie appeared beside him, carrying fresh lamps. She'd been released from questioning the previous evening, her testimony revealing more about the household secrets than anyone had expected. The young maid had been keeping her own careful records, dates and times of mysterious visitors, strange deliveries, whispered conversations. Her orphan's survival instinct had made her an inadvertent chronicler of the chateau's decline. "Will they really let the family keep the chateau?" she asked. Henri considered his answer carefully. "The building? Yes, but not the life it represented. That's already gone, has been for years. They've just been living in its echo." Above them they could hear movement. Philippe was leaving for Paris, his debts cleared by the state in exchange for his complete cooperation. He'd revealed names, dates, amounts, the entire network of his gambling associates who'd been used by the Corsicans to entrap other noble families. Henri had watched him sign his testimony with a shaking hand, finally sober, finally understanding the weight of what he'd been part of. Isabelle descended the stairs, dressed in traveling clothes Henri hadn't seen before. She looked younger somehow, as if confession had lifted years from her shoulders. "I wanted to thank you, Monsieur Dubois, before I leave." "Leave?" "Fouché has offered me a position, translator and document analyst for the prefecture. It seems my years of managing false accounts have qualified me to detect them in others." She smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "I'll be useful, properly useful, for the first time in my life." Henri felt unexpected warmth at this news. Of all the casualties of this affair, Isabelle had deserved at least, trapped by birth and duty into a life of genteel decline. "Your father will remain here with Mother. The state will provide a small pension. Apparently, great-grandfather's information about smuggling routes during the Crimean War was valuable enough to earn some consideration. They'll live quietly, perhaps more honestly than any Montmoreau has in generations." Jean-Baptiste appeared in the cellar entrance. The estate manager, or former estate manager, as his position was now unclear, had aged visibly in the past days. The revelation of his parentage, instead of bringing him closer to the family, had somehow severed his last ties to the place. "The vineyards," he said to no one in particular. "Someone needs to tend them. The vines don't care about our human dramas." "You'll stay then?" Isabelle asked. "Where else would I go? My blood is in this soil, legitimate or not." He laughed, but there was no bitterness in it now, only acceptance. "Besides, someone needs to remember the truth of this place, not the story that will be told in the salons of Bordeaux." Galet's fate had been decided the previous evening. Prison, but not the hard labor he'd feared. Instead, he would work for the government, his knowledge of smuggling routes and methods too valuable to waste. Henri had watched the wine merchant accept his sentence with the same calculation he'd once applied to profit margins, already planning how to reduce his term through cooperation. Father Mathieu entered the cellar, followed by Thomas. The priest had been exempted from prosecution. The seal of confession protected him legally, and his moral authority in the village made him politically untouchable. But Henri could see the weight of knowledge in his eyes. Every secret he'd heard in confession, every sin he'd absolved, had been preparing him for this moment of collective revelation. "I've come to bless the cellar," the priest said simply.
"To cleanse it, if such a thing is possible."
They gathered in a small circle around the weeping bottle. Henri, Isabelle, Marie, Jean-Baptiste, Thomas, and old Jacques, who'd been guided down by familiar touch. Father Mathieu spoke in Latin, then French, his words echoing off the stone walls that had heard so many secrets, held so many lies. "This bottle," the priest said, placing his hand on the famous vessel, "has been a false prophet, speaking truths we assigned to it rather than truths it possessed. Like all omens, it showed us what we feared to see directly." Old Jacques reached out, his fingers finding the bottle with surprising accuracy. "My grandfather told me once that every wine contains the story of its year, the rain, the sun, the hands that pick the grapes."
This bottle has been holding the story of this house, all the moisture of our fears condensing on its surface. Henri made his final notes, recording the bottle's position, temperature, the exact conditions of its storage. For his official report, he would explain the condensation as a natural phenomenon caused by air pressure changes from the tunnel's use. But he knew the truth was both simpler and more complex. The bottle wept when the family's crimes reached a certain pressure, when the lies could no longer be contained. Fouché arrived in the afternoon for Henri's final report. They met in the library, surrounded by ledgers that documented 2 centuries of gradual dissolution. The prefecture listened without interruption as Henri laid out his findings. 12,000 bottles, of which nearly 1,000 were forgeries, another 2,000 stolen and replaced over the years, the rest genuine, but often improperly stored or documented. "The actual value?" Fouché asked. "Enough to pay the family's legitimate debts, if sold carefully. Not enough to maintain the chateau as it was, but sufficient for a modest life." "And your fee?" Henri had been thinking about this. "I'll take it in wine. 1 bottle." He handed Fouché a specific catalogue number. "A 1749 Chateau d'Yquem. Not the weeping bottle, its twin, stored in a different section, never touched by legend or crime." Fouché smiled slightly. "You could ask for more. Your work here has been invaluable." "I've been paid already," Henri replied, thinking of the lessons learned, the patterns observed, the human drama that had unfolded before him like wine revealing its character as it breathed. Besides, 1 perfect bottle is worth more than a cellar full of compromises. October 7th arrived with the kind of pristine autumn morning that made the vineyards of Bordeaux look eternal, as if nothing could ever disturb their ordered rows and patient rhythms. Henri stood in his tower room one last time, his cases packed, the 1749 Chateau d'Yquem carefully wrapped in cloth and straw. Through the window, he could see the estate awakening to its new reality, smaller, quieter, perhaps more honest. The Comte and Comtesse had taken their breakfast on the terrace, a simple meal served by Marie, who had chosen to stay despite everything. The young woman had surprised everyone by refusing offers of employment elsewhere, declaring that someone needed to remember the chateau as it truly was, not as legend would paint it. Henri suspected there was more to her decision. Thomas had been visiting regularly, and the church did need a new caretaker for its properties. Old Jacques sat in the kitchen garden, his face turned toward the sun like an ancient vine seeking light. He would stay too, of course. Where else would a blind cellar keeper go? But his role had changed. No longer guardian of secrets, he had become the chateau's memory, the one who could tell visitors where each stone had come from, which generation had built which wall, how the weeping bottle had come to rest in its particular alcove. Henri made his way to the cellar one final time. The famous bottle still sat in its niche, now bearing a small placard that Isabel had written before her departure. The weeping bottle, a natural phenomenon of condensation, observed 1851 to 1883. A scientific explanation to replace supernatural fear, though Henri wondered if future generations would find their own meanings in those carefully measured words. Jean-Baptiste was there, checking the temperature and humidity levels with instruments Henri had left him. The bastard son had found his place at last, not as secret heir or resentful servant, but as curator of what remained. The state had appointed him official conservator of the collection, responsible for its proper maintenance and gradual legal sale. "The tunnels being permanently sealed tomorrow," Jean-Baptiste said, "filled with concrete from both ends. Fouché wants no possibility of its resurrection." "And the documents found inside?" "Burned, after being copied for the archives, except," Jean-Baptiste pulled out a single sheet of paper, aged and water-stained. "I saved this. Thought you might appreciate it." Henri read the faded writing, a receipt for 12 bottles of Chateau d'Yquem, vintage 1749, delivered to the chateau in 1751. At the bottom, a note in different ink. "One to be kept always in the third alcove as reminder of Providence." It was signed by the first Comte de Montmoreau to bear that name. "He knew," Henri said quietly. "Even then, someone knew the bottle would become special, would gather meaning like dust. Or perhaps," Jean-Baptiste suggested, "he created what he knew, set aside one bottle to be the family's conscience, its barometer. Every family needs something to fear more than truth." Father Mathieu arrived to offer Henri a ride to the station in the church cart. The priest looked older, but somehow lighter, as if confession had flowed both ways during the investigation. As they loaded Henri's cases, the priest spoke quietly. "You've done more than solve a mystery, Monsieur Dubois. You've given us permission to stop pretending." The ride to Saint-Emilion station took them through vineyards already being prepared for next year's growth. Workers were clearing dead vines, replacing them with new rootstock, the eternal cycle of death and renewal that gave wine its poignancy. Henri thought of his late wife, how she would have appreciated this landscape, this story of human frailty dressed in noble vintage. At the station, the priest helped Henri with his cases, then paused. "The weeping bottle. Do you think it will ever weep again?" Henri considered the question. "Every bottle weeps eventually, Father. When the cork fails, when the temperature changes too quickly, when time itself becomes too heavy to bear. But perhaps now it can weep honestly, for simple physical reasons, without the burden of prophecy." The train arrived in its cloud of steam and significance. Henri boarded, found his compartment, and carefully placed the wrapped bottle in the overhead rack. As the train pulled away, he could see the chateau on its hill, looking smaller than when he'd arrived, but somehow more solid, as if the removal of illusions had revealed the actual stones beneath. The journey back to Paris would take 8 hours. Henri settled into his seat and pulled out his journal, beginning to write his official report. But his mind kept returning to the cellar, to that moment when everyone stood around the weeping bottle while Father Mathieu offered his blessing. They had all been seeking absolution, for crimes committed and inherited, for lies told and retold until they became family history, for the simple human failure of wanting more than circumstances allowed.
The 1749 Chateau de Chem rested above him, its golden contents waiting patiently for the right moment to be opened. Henri had no specific plan for it, perhaps a future evening when the weight of truth-telling became too heavy. Or perhaps never, leaving it as his own weeping bottle, a reminder of the week when he'd descended into a family's darkness and emerged with something like understanding.
Outside the window, the countryside of France rolled by, vineyard after vineyard, chateau after chateau, each with its own secrets, its own accommodations with survival. The wine trade would continue, Henri knew, as would the smuggling, the forgeries, the careful dance between legal and illegal that kept commerce flowing like wine from bottle to glass. But perhaps, in one small corner of Bordeaux, truth had created a small, clear space where a family could rebuild on honest ground. As afternoon gave way to evening, Henri dozed, dreaming of cellars that went deeper than limestone, of bottles that contained not wine, but years, of a young woman named Marie, who had watched everything and waited for the right moment to speak. In his dream, the weeping bottle was crying again, but the tears were clear as water, washing the dust from its label, revealing words that had always been there, but never seen. He woke as the train approached Paris, the city's lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dark. Tomorrow, he would return to his normal work, cataloging, appraising, determining value in a world that constantly shifted its definitions. But tonight, he would go to his small apartment, pour a glass of ordinary wine, and sit by his window, thinking about the Montmoreaus beginning their new life in their ancient home. The weeping bottle would remain in its alcove, he knew, visited by curious tourists who would hear a simplified version of its story. The condensation would be explained, the mystery solved, the legend diffused. But Henri suspected that on certain nights, when the temperature was just right and the air pressure changed just so, the bottle would still weep. Not for future catastrophes or past crimes, but for the simple, eternal truth that all things of beauty, wine, families, chateau, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and sometimes their own redemption. The train pulled into the Gare d'Austerlitz with a final sigh of steam. Henri collected his cases, cradled the precious bottle, and stepped onto the platform. Paris engulfed him immediately. The noise, the gaslight, the endless movement of a city that never stopped to consider its own mortality. But Henri carried with him the quiet of the cellar, the patient darkness where wine slowly became itself, where truth aged into something bearable. Walking home through familiar streets, Henri Dubois, master appraiser, keeper of other people's secrets, allowed himself a small smile. The weeping bottle had taught him something valuable, that every tear, whether of wine or water, whether of fear or relief, contained within it the possibility of clarity. And sometimes that was enough philosophy for one man, one life, one carefully wrapped bottle of wine that might never be opened, but would always be treasured, like the memory of a week when the truth finally found its voice in a cellar beneath a crumbling chateau, where a bottle wept not for what was lost, but for what remained.